The morning drizzle, like a delicate veil shrouding the English countryside, had gradually turned into heavy downpours by the afternoon. The sky was a somber gray, weighed down by brooding clouds that dimmed the daylight, making it feel as though time itself had swallowed the sun. The narrow roads outside the village of Ashwell, already winding and uneven, now became slick and treacherous, transformed into miniature streams as rainwater surged across the ground. The scene was eerily still, save for the patter of raindrops on bare branches and the whisper of wind threading through roadside hedges. On that narrow, rain-soaked lane, Arthur Bellamy's vintage silver-gray Bentley stood forlornly, an incongruous figure amidst the desolate surroundings. Inside the car, Arthur, a man in his early 50s with meticulously groomed gray-streaked hair, sat motionless behind the wheel. His tailored suit and leather gloves could not conceal the weariness etched on his face, a face marked by years of relentless toil in the unforgiving world of business. Arthur drummed his fingers lightly on the steering wheel, the rhythm steady yet betraying a simmering frustration. The stillness of the countryside, usually a source of tranquility, now only amplified his sense of isolation and helplessness. The luxury car, a symbol of his wealth and success, had become a gilded cage, trapping him on an empty road. The rear tire was flat, and his phone had long since run out of battery. He glanced through the windshield, watching the rain streak down in winding rivulets, as though trying to drown the world outside. "Damn it," Arthur muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the steady drumbeat of rain on the car roof. Time dragged on, each minute heavier than the last. His fingers began to tremble slightly, though whether from the cold or from the creeping despair, he couldn't tell. Arthur had made billion-pound decisions in high-powered boardrooms across London, yet here he was, utterly powerless against the chill silence of the countryside. No cars passed by, no figures emerged from the mist. Only the long, winding road stretched ahead, endless and empty, shrouded in rain. Just as his impatience reached its breaking point, a faint silhouette emerged through the downpour. At first, Arthur caught only a flicker of movement, but the figure gradually sharpened as it drew closer. It was a boy, no older than 14, wearing a tattered jacket patched with mismatched fabric. His mud-streaked trousers clung to his thin frame, and his worn boots were no match for the puddles soaking his every step. Despite his small stature, there was a strange confidence in the way he moved through the rain. Arthur rolled down the window, letting the rain splatter against the cuff of his tailored sleeve. The boy came nearer, his bright eyes clear, a faint smile lighting up his weathered face. "Car trouble, sir?" the boy asked, his voice bright yet steady, cutting through the rhythmic patter of the rain. Arthur hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the boy's slight figure. He looked frail, almost fragile, but his eyes, sharp and filled with a quiet determination, somehow put Arthur at ease. "Yes," Arthur admitted, his voice gruff from the cold. "The rear tire's flat, and I've no way to call for help." The boy nodded, as though such situations were commonplace for him. "I can help," he said simply, shrugging off a threadbare satchel slung over his shoulder and setting it down on the ground. "Do you have a spare tire?" Arthur still held a trace of doubt. He gestured toward the car's trunk, his tone cautious. "You're sure you know what you're doing?" A grin broke across the boy's face, revealing bright white teeth that stood out against his tan skin. "I've helped my dad change tires plenty of times. It's not hard." The boy didn't wait for Arthur's response. His small but sturdy hands deftly opened the trunk and pulled out the necessary tools. His movements were quick and sure, his familiarity with the task evident. Arthur could only watch in silence, mesmerized by the boy's efficiency. Despite the icy rain, the boy worked with practiced ease, as though the tools in his hands were old friends. Arthur sat in the car, his eyes fixed on the boy's every movement through the rearview mirror. The boy didn't say much, but his calm and focused demeanor rendered any explanation unnecessary. When he rolled up his sleeves, Arthur noticed the calluses on the boy's small arms, evidence of a life accustomed to hard labor. Despite the relentless rain, Thomas, as he had introduced himself, showed no signs of discomfort. On the contrary, he worked with quiet concentration, as though changing a tire was not just a task but a mission requiring utmost precision. Arthur stepped out of the car, not so much to assist as to observe more closely. Shielding himself with an umbrella, he watched Thomas's every move. The boy carefully inspected the flat tire, used a jack to lift the car, and deftly removed the lug nuts with a practiced efficiency that Arthur doubted he had ever seen in someone so young. "Where did you learn to do this?" Arthur asked, his deep voice tinged with genuine curiosity. "My dad taught me," Thomas replied simply, his eyes never leaving the wheel. He said a man should know how to fix the basics. Arthur sensed there was something deeper in those words, but he chose not to press further. Thomas's small hands, scratched and dirted by years of toil, moved with remarkable skill, strong, deliberate, and precise. He didn't seem burdened by the physical effort. Instead, he approached the task as though it were his duty, an unspoken code to help someone in need. The rain seemed to ease slightly, but the sky remained an unyielding gray, casting a pall over the world below. Arthur stood there, feeling a strange sensation creeping into his chest. How could a child exude such confidence in a situation like this? He wore no new shoes, no warm coat, yet carried himself with an undeniable sense of dignity. "Do you often do things like this?" Arthur asked, breaking the silence. Thomas looked up, his bright eyes shimmering, though devoid of any hint of pride. "Sometimes, sir. I don't like standing by when I can do something to help." That answer silenced Arthur again. In his world, every action had a motive, usually money, power, or some other tangible gain. But this boy seemed to need nothing but the satisfaction of doing what was right. After about 15 minutes, Thomas finished the task. Straightening up, he took a deep breath and turned to Arthur. His jacket was soaked through. His hands were covered in mud and grease, but his face lit up with a faint, unassuming smile. "All done, sir," he said, his tone light, as though he had just completed something entirely unremarkable. Arthur glanced at the newly replaced tire, now firmly in place, and couldn't help but feel impressed. Pulling out his wallet, he took out several crisp bills and extended them toward the boy. "Take this. I truly appreciate your help," Arthur said, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised even himself. But Thomas only looked at him and gently shook his head. "I don't need it, sir." Arthur was taken aback. "But—" Thomas stepped back, raising a hand to decline. "I'm just glad I could help," he said, his gaze direct but respectful. Arthur didn't know what to say. The refusal wasn't out of shyness, nor because the boy didn't need money. It was the refusal of someone who understood his own worth, someone who didn't want his kindness to be reduced to a transaction. Arthur stood there, watching as the boy's figure gradually faded into the rain. The old satchel swung on his shoulder, his heavy boots squelching against the sodden road. He didn't look back, didn't say another word, as though what had just happened was the most natural thing in the world. Arthur climbed back into his car, his mind swirling with unanswered questions. Who was this boy? Where had he come from? And how could he carry such confidence and kindness without expecting anything in return? The rain continued its relentless downpour, as if trying to wash away the fleeting moment. But it had already etched itself into Arthur's memory. Indelibly vivid, the name Thomas lingered in his mind, simple yet strangely profound, just like the boy himself. The Bentley rolled slowly down the winding road toward Ashwell Manor, leaving behind the cold, rain-drenched landscape. Yet Arthur's thoughts stayed with Thomas. The boy's bright eyes, calm smile, and firm refusal of the money, an act so rare it unsettled him. A peculiar feeling stirred in Arthur's heart, a mix of admiration and an unnameable curiosity. Night began to fall, bringing with it the biting chill of the countryside. As Arthur turned into the gates of Ashwell Manor, the great iron gates swung open slowly, their hinges creaking in the stillness. The manor loomed ahead, grand and imposing among the mist-shrouded trees. Ivy-covered stone walls gave it an air of age and history, while towering chimneys seemed to challenge the gloomy sky. Arthur stepped into the vast entrance hall. The marble floor reflected the dim glow of a chandelier overhead, but instead of comfort, the space felt hollow. His footsteps echoed across the expanse, each one a reminder of the emptiness around him. He paused for a moment in the center of the hall, staring at the ornate staircase that spiraled upward, its polished banister gleaming faintly in the muted light. Normally, this grand space symbolized his achievements, a testament to years of effort and success. But tonight, it seemed to mock him, its opulence clashing with the unassuming simplicity of a boy who asked for nothing. Arthur's thoughts returned to Thomas, to his quiet determination and unwavering kindness. It was rare, no, almost unheard of, in Arthur's world to encounter someone so pure of intention. He sank into a nearby armchair, the leather cold against his back, and let out a deep sigh. The boy's words echoed in his mind. "I don't like standing by when I can do something to help." The storm outside raged on, the wind howling against the manor's sturdy walls. Yet inside, Arthur felt something stir within him, a restlessness he hadn't known in years. Something about the boy, about the encounter on that lonely road, had unsettled the foundations of his carefully constructed life. And though he didn't know it yet, this chance meeting would soon unravel a series of events that would reshape everything he thought he understood about the world and himself. In his study, Arthur sank into the familiar leather armchair. He sipped a measure of brandy, feeling the warm liquid trail down his throat. But the heat couldn't dispel the chill lodged deep within. His mind wandered to the encounters of his life, lavish parties, cold handshakes in high-powered boardrooms, deals sealed with nods worth millions of pounds. In all of that, he had never met anyone quite like Thomas. "I don't need it, sir. I'm just glad I could help." The boy's words echoed in his mind, soft yet challenging. A child of his age, living in such circumstances, how could he so casually refuse money? It wasn't arrogance. It was simply that he didn't see the need to accept it. Thomas had done good not for gain, but out of pure, unadulterated kindness, a rarity that Arthur had never encountered in his life. That night, the vastness of Arthur's room felt more oppressive than ever. The golden light from his desk lamp illuminated the walls, casting shadows over the portraits of his ancestors. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him, adding an inexplicable weight to his unease. Arthur leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had thought his life was perfect. He had wealth, status, and a magnificent manor to call home. Yet now, in the stillness of the night, he felt something was missing, something Thomas had, and in his own way, had made clear. "That boy," Arthur murmured. A flicker of envy stirred within him, a strange sensation he didn't want to admit. At Thomas's age, Arthur had once lived a simple life in a small village, but over time, his hunger for success had stripped away much of the simplicity and honesty the boy embodied. Near midnight, Arthur still couldn't sleep. He stepped out onto the balcony, standing in the biting cold, gazing down at his expansive garden. The pale moonlight bathed the neatly trimmed hedges and motionless stone statues. In the silence, he wondered what it all meant if there was no one to share it with. The brief encounter with Thomas had awakened a question he had never dared to ask. Had he truly lived, or merely existed amidst lifeless material possessions? Thomas's image haunted him still, muddy hands, bright eyes. It wasn't just the boy's kindness that unsettled Arthur. It was how he had made him remember a part of himself long buried beneath his luxurious life. Arthur sighed deeply, the sound heavy and resigned. Before retreating inside, he knew tonight would bring no rest. When morning came, Arthur awoke with an unusual sense of urgency. Pale rays of dawn seeped through the curtains, but the sky remained overcast, mirroring his mood. Dressed in a thick coat, Arthur stepped outside, ignoring the lingering dampness from the previous night's rain. He climbed into his Bentley, this time not simply to drive, but to seek an answer to the turmoil within. The engine roared to life, and the car sped down the gravel path. His goal was clear. He had to find the boy. Arthur began his search on the road where he had first met Thomas. Last night's rain had left puddles along the lane, and a thin mist clung to the bare branches overhead. He slowed his pace, his eyes scanning every turn and cottage along the way. But aside from silence and the occasional crow scavenging, there was no sign of the boy. Stopping at a small roadside petrol station, Arthur entered, pulling off his leather gloves to warm his chilled hands. The station's proprietor, an elderly man with oil-streaked gray hair, looked up as Arthur inquired, "A boy named Thomas, around 14, might live nearby?" Arthur asked. The man furrowed his brow, thinking for a moment, then shook his head. "Not sure, sir, but you might try asking at the village pub. The landlady there knows everyone around these parts." Arthur nodded his thanks, and soon the Bentley was rolling along the road that led to the heart of the village. The pub, the Crow's Nest, sat modestly at the corner of a small crossroads. The old wooden door creaked as Arthur pushed it open. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the familiar scent of burning wood and fermented ale. A few men sat around the bar, speaking in low tones, but every eye turned to him as he entered. Arthur approached the bar, where an older woman wearing a worn apron was wiping glasses. She regarded him with a curious look, as though trying to place who he was and why he was here. "Good evening," Arthur began, his tone polite but laced with urgency. "I'm looking for a boy. His name is Thomas. I met him yesterday nearby, and I was wondering if you might know where he lives." The woman paused, her eyes narrowing as though dredging up a memory. After a moment, she nodded. "Thomas Grayson?" she asked, and when Arthur nodded in confirmation, she smiled. "That would be him. He lives at the end of Bramble Lane, near the woods. A good lad, always helping folks out. His mother works at the bakery. You shouldn't have trouble finding him." Arthur thanked her, leaving a small tip on the counter before heading out. Relief washed over him. He finally had a clear direction. The road to Bramble Lane grew narrower and rougher the farther he went. The grander homes gradually gave way to smaller, older cottages with tiled roofs and overgrown gardens. On either side of the lane, moss-covered trees swayed gently in the wind, creating a scene of quiet serenity. At the end of the lane, Arthur spotted a small house nestled among the bushes, set apart from the others. The house looked weathered but tidy, surrounded by a low wooden fence. The front garden, though a little overrun with wildflowers and weeds, exuded a cozy charm. Arthur parked the car outside, stepping out with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. He hadn't decided exactly what to say, but he knew he had to see Thomas. He approached the door, raising his hand to knock, but hesitated. In that moment, he felt like an intruder, stepping into a world so different from his own, simple, warm, and worlds apart from his life of luxury. Shaking off the thought, he knocked gently 3 times on the weathered wood. The door opened, and a woman appeared. She looked to be in her early 30s, with brown hair tied neatly at the back and bright eyes that, despite their weariness, held a kind warmth. Her hands bore traces of flour, as though she had just stepped away from the kitchen. She studied Arthur with a mixture of surprise and cautious curiosity. "Good evening," Arthur said, his voice slightly uncertain. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe I met your son yesterday. He helped me change a tire." The woman's expression softened, and a small smile tugged at her lips. "That would be Thomas," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "He's always helping someone. I'm Rose Grayson. Please, come in. He's out in the back garden." Arthur thanked her and stepped over the threshold into the small house. Instantly, he was enveloped in a warmth he hadn't felt in years, a kind of warmth his sprawling mansion had long lacked. The furnishings were modest but well kept, and the walls were adorned with family photographs and a few childlike drawings. In this space, Arthur felt as though he'd stepped into a place alive with genuine life. "That boy," Arthur thought as he followed Rose to the back garden. "There's something truly extraordinary about him." The wooden door creaked open slowly, and Arthur immediately felt the warmth of an entirely different world. Standing before him was a woman, likely in her early 30s, with neatly tied brown hair. a few stray strands clinging to her forehead. Her hands were still dusted with flour, evidence that she had just stepped out of the kitchen. Despite the weariness etched on her face, her eyes radiated kindness and patience, as if she was well accustomed to life's challenges. "Good evening," Arthur began, his voice slightly trembling, not from the cold, but from an unfamiliar sense of unease. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe I met your son yesterday. He helped me change a tire." The woman studied him for a moment before her expression softened, and a faint smile appeared at the corners of her mouth. "That would be Thomas," she said, her eyes lighting up with pride. "He's always like that, always looking for ways to help. I'm Rose Grayson. Please, come in. Don't be shy. He's out back, probably fixing something again." Arthur nodded in gratitude and stepped across the threshold. The door closed behind him, shutting out the cold, lifeless world outside and welcoming him into a warm, cozy interior. The house was small, clearly shaped by years of hard work and perseverance, yet everything was neatly arranged, and the well-cared-for furniture exuded a sense of comfort. Arthur glanced around the room. The walls were adorned with family photos showing smiling faces, despite what must have been a modest life. Interspersed among them were a few childlike drawings, likely Thomas's from years ago. The uneven crayon strokes carried a sincerity he couldn't find in the expensive paintings lining the halls of his own manor. A fragrant aroma wafted from the kitchen, a mix of freshly baked bread and a simple dish simmering on the stove. Arthur felt the warmth emanating from every corner of the house, and suddenly he realized how long it had been since he'd experienced this. The feeling of a real home. Rose led him to the back door and pointed toward a small garden surrounded by a low wooden fence. "Thomas is out there," she said, her voice tinged with pride. "He's always busy with little projects in the yard. Can't seem to sit still." Arthur stepped outside, letting the familiar sounds of the countryside greet him, birds chirping in the distance, the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the creak of an old chicken coop that Thomas was repairing. The boy was crouched on the ground, carefully tying loose wooden planks of the chicken coop with an old piece of rope. His patched-up coat was smeared with mud, but his small hands moved deftly. Arthur stood still for a moment, watching as though afraid to disrupt the boy's focus. "Hello, sir." Thomas looked up, his bright eyes lighting up when he recognized Arthur. "What brings you here?" He stood up, brushing the dirt off his trousers, his expression a mix of surprise and his usual quiet confidence. Arthur stepped closer, his polished shoes leaving smudged prints on the damp ground. "I wanted to thank you again," he said, feeling an unfamiliar sense of humility as he stood before the boy's earnest and unpretentious nature. Thomas tilted his head, his eyes curious but without a trace of discomfort. "I didn't do anything big, sir. It was just a tire." Arthur smiled. "Perhaps to you, it wasn't a big deal, but to me, it meant far more than you realize." The words made Thomas pause for a moment. He fidgeted with the piece of rope on the coop, as though to hide his slight embarrassment. But then, as usual, he smiled, a smile so easy and genuine. "Well, would you like to try fixing the chicken coop? It probably needs more help than your tire did." Arthur laughed, a sound he hadn't expected to hear from himself in years. Shaking his head, he felt a wave of inexplicable relief wash over him. Perhaps Thomas hadn't just fixed his flat tire that day. Perhaps he had also mended something long broken inside Arthur himself. As the evening light softened, the faint rays of the setting sun filtered through the leaves, casting pale golden streaks across the Graysons' backyard. Arthur stood beside Thomas, feeling an inexplicable warmth creeping into his heart, not just from the cozy atmosphere of this humble home, but from the presence of the boy himself. Thomas continued working diligently, repairing the last section of the chicken coop's wire mesh. His small hands moved with precision and determination. Meanwhile, Arthur let his gaze wander. The modest garden, the branches heavy with rain from the earlier downpour, and the old but clean and simple house. All of it seemed to tell a story of resilience, a life that wasn't easy but was lived with pride and effort. Arthur decided to break the silence. "Thomas, I have something I'd like to say," he began, his voice low but earnest. The boy looked up, his clear eyes filled with curiosity. "Yes, sir." Arthur drew a deep breath, trying to articulate his thoughts clearly. "You and your family, you've shown remarkable strength in making the most of what you have. But I'd like to do something for you. As a gesture of thanks, I could help improve this house, or provide your family with things you might need." Thomas paused, his small hands momentarily still. Then he shook his head, his gaze suddenly serious, far beyond what Arthur expected from a 14-year-old. "Thank you, sir, but we don't need charity," Thomas said, his voice steady and without hesitation. "My mother always says that while we don't have much, we have enough. If you truly want to help," he stopped for a moment, a thoughtful spark lighting up his eyes, "do something for the village." Arthur was taken aback by the response. "The village?" Thomas nodded, his expression unwavering. "Yes, there are people here who have it harder than we do. If you want to help, think of them." Arthur stood still, letting Thomas's words sink in. The boy wasn't just declining personal assistance. He was redirecting that goodwill toward an entire community. To Arthur, it was an act of maturity and selflessness far beyond what he expected from someone so young. "You wouldn't feel uncomfortable if I helped the village?" Arthur asked, a hint of curiosity in his voice. Thomas smiled, a simple yet profound smile. "If it helps everyone, why would I feel uncomfortable? Everyone could use a bit of help now and then, sir. But sometimes, what matters most is helping the right people, in the right way." Arthur felt something stir deep within him. Thomas's words, straightforward and unpretentious, carried a weight that left him thinking. To Arthur, offering help had always been about numbers, grand donations, or lavish projects. But to Thomas, it was about sincerity and directing aid to those who truly needed it. In that moment, Arthur realized he wasn't just learning about kindness. He was being shown a new perspective on what it truly meant to make a difference. As the last light of day faded, Arthur looked back at Thomas one more time before leaving. "I'll think about what you said," he said, his voice low but earnest. "Thank you, Thomas." Thomas simply nodded, his eyes reflecting a wisdom far beyond his years. "Safe travels, sir," he replied, then bent down to continue his unfinished work. On the way back to Ashwell Manor, Arthur couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. The boy's words had not only made him reflect, but had also forced him to confront himself. "The village," Arthur murmured, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, where faint streetlights flickered in the darkness. "Perhaps it's time I do something truly meaningful." That night, in the vast solitude of his room, Arthur didn't retreat into silence as he usually did. Instead, he began drafting a plan not just to repay Thomas, but to make a genuine impact. In the early days after Arthur decided to fulfill his promise, the atmosphere in Ashwell Village remained as heavy as it had been for years. Dilapidated rooftops, rotting window frames, and cracked cobblestone streets were familiar sights for the villagers. They had lived with hardship for so long that few dared to hope for real change. But then, subtle signs of transformation began to emerge. One morning, under rare rays of sunshine, trucks loaded with construction materials rolled into the village center. A team of workers started repairing the long-abandoned village hall, its roof leaking and wooden floors decaying. News spread quickly, and whispers filled the air. "What's going on here?" an elderly woman outside the general store asked, her eyes skeptical. "Word is, it's Mr. Bellamy from Ashwell Manor," a man replied, his voice laced with doubt. "Suddenly wants to help the village, but who knows what his motives are." Arthur, wrapped in a heavy coat, stood by the roadside watching the workers. His polished shoes were ill-suited to the muddy ground, but he didn't seem to care. In his hands was a detailed plan he had spent countless nights perfecting. The village hall would be the first project, not just a venue for community events. It would also serve as a small hub for residents to discuss important matters. Next on the list was the small school at the edge of the village. Arthur had contacted a second-hand book supplier in London, and within days, large crates filled with textbooks, children's stories, and educational materials arrived. His efforts didn't stop there. He paid attention to even the smallest details, replacing old streetlights so villagers could walk safely at night, repairing roofs for struggling families, and ensuring that every task, big or small, was carried out with patience and care. It was as if he was trying to mend not just a village, but also a long-forgotten part of himself. At first, the villagers were skeptical. They were accustomed to fending for themselves, rarely receiving help from anyone, let alone a wealthy man living in an opulent manor. But as each project was completed, each street repaved, each roof repaired, their doubts gave way to gratitude. One day, while Arthur was inspecting the progress on the village hall repairs, Thomas suddenly appeared beside him. The boy wore his familiar patched coat, his boots still caked in mud. "People in the village are talking about you," he said, his tone playful but tinged with admiration. "What are they saying?" Arthur asked, his eyes glinting with curiosity. "At first, they didn't believe you," Thomas admitted. "But now, I think they're starting to see you actually care." Arthur smiled, a wave of relief washing over him. Turning to Thomas, he asked, "What about you? Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" Thomas nodded. "You're doing great, sir. But if you want to do more, I have an idea." "What idea?" Arthur leaned in, genuinely intrigued. "The old mill by the river," Thomas replied, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "It used to be the heart of the village. Everyone here remembers when it was still running. If we restore it, it could bring jobs to a lot of people." Arthur considered the suggestion, picturing the old mill in his mind. It was a grand structure, now abandoned for years, overgrown with moss and ivy. As a child, he had heard his parents speak of the mill as the soul of Ashwell village, providing flour not just to the locals, but also to neighboring areas. But over time, it had been replaced by larger, more modern factories and faded into obscurity. "Do you really think it can be restored?" Arthur asked, a hint of doubt in his voice. Thomas nodded confidently. "I believe it can, and if we do, the villagers won't have to worry about leaving to find work elsewhere." Arthur stood silent for a moment, but within him, a resolution was forming. "All right," he said, his voice firm and determined. "We'll restore the mill." In the weeks that followed, the mill by the river became the heart of Ashwell village. Arthur hired a team of skilled workers, but it was the villagers themselves who joined in, each lending a hand to restore the historic structure. They cleaned up, repaired the massive wheels, and replaced broken equipment. Thomas, with his boundless curiosity, was there every day, learning from the workers and asking questions about every detail of the process. Arthur, watching from a distance, felt his heart swell with a sense of purpose he had long forgotten, the joy of truly making a difference. The mill, much like Ashwell village, was coming back to life, thanks to a boy with a big vision and a man rediscovering how to repair the parts of his life he had once neglected. One spring morning, Ashwell village basked in soft, golden sunlight. The once bare branches of trees began to sprout tender green shoots, and birdsong echoed from the roadside bushes, blending harmoniously with the bustling sounds of work at the riverside mill. The mill, once a crumbling ruin, now stood tall and proud, a testament to the power of unity and hope. Its massive wheels had been fully restored, and the rotting wooden beams had been replaced. Inside, new machinery hummed alongside preserved antique components, creating a seamless blend of past and present. Villagers gathered outside the mill, dressed simply but tidily. They had come not just to witness the official reopening of the mill, but to experience the transformation that had spread throughout Ashwell. Arthur stood amidst the crowd, his demeanor calm but his eyes alight with pride. For the first time in years, he no longer felt like an outsider. The whispers of doubt that once surrounded him had been replaced with warm smiles and grateful nods. He was no longer the cold, solitary man in the grand manor on the hill. He had become part of this community, not through wealth, but through sincerity and meaningful actions. Thomas stood beside him, his eyes shining as brightly as the morning sun. He couldn't hide his excitement as he watched the mill wheels begin to turn slowly under the flow of water. Over the past weeks, Thomas had spent nearly all his time at the mill, learning from the workers and from Arthur himself. "You've done well," Arthur said, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "This mill isn't just mine, or anyone else's. It belongs to the whole village, and you're an important part of that." Thomas smiled, his expression radiant yet humble. "I just followed what you taught me," he replied. "I still have so much to learn." In the weeks that followed, the mill truly became the centerpiece of the village. The people of Ashwell, who once had to leave their homes to find work in faraway places, could now return and work close to their families. Sacks of freshly milled flour were packed and loaded onto carts, which departed the village to supply markets in the surrounding areas. The hum of machinery blended with the cheerful chatter of workers, creating a symphony of life that Ashwell had lacked for many years. The lush green fields surrounding the village basked in sunlight, while the laughter and voices of villagers echoed from the market square to the riverside, where the mill worked tirelessly. Ashwell was no longer the quiet, somber village it once was. Arthur's efforts had breathed new life into the community, and the transformation reached far beyond its borders, spreading along the winding country roads of England. The carts carrying flour from Ashwell's mill no longer stopped at nearby markets. They began to venture farther, reaching neighboring towns and even distant outskirts. Ashwell's flour gained a reputation for its high quality and the traditional methods Arthur was determined to preserve as part of the village's identity. The benefits of this transformation extended beyond Ashwell. Neighboring villages, facing similar struggles, began to share in the newfound prosperity. Some families from other villages came to Ashwell to learn how to run a mill or to seek employment. Arthur turned no one away. He welcomed them with an open heart, seeing it as another way to repay what he had learned from Thomas. The mill became a model for others to follow. Nearby villages started restoring their own abandoned structures, rediscovering value in what they had long considered lost. Arthur became an informal mentor for these projects, but it was Thomas, now more mature, who truly served as the greatest source of inspiration. One afternoon, Arthur and Thomas stood beside the mill, watching the rushing water turn the great wheels steadily. Arthur glanced at Thomas, his chest swelling with an indescribable sense of pride. "You know, Thomas," he said, his voice warm and steady, "what you're doing here doesn't just help this village. It will impact far more people than you realize." Thomas turned to him, gratitude shining in his eyes. "I'm just doing what I can, sir," he replied. "Everything I've learned is because of you. Without you, I never would have thought I could achieve any of this." Arthur smiled, but deep down he knew the truth. "No, Thomas," he said, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're the one who's done it all. I only gave you a chance, but you turned it into something extraordinary." Arthur's expression grew more serious than usual as he faced Thomas. "Thomas," he began, "I want you to think about going to university." Thomas's eyes widened in surprise. "University, sir? I've never thought about that." Arthur's smile softened. "It's time you did. You have talent, Thomas, and that talent shouldn't be confined to this place. You can learn more, do more, and help more people." Thomas fell silent, his head bowed as though weighing the idea. "But who will take care of the mill? And the village? I don't want to leave everyone behind." Arthur's gaze was steady, his tone firm yet gentle. "Thomas, what you've done for this village won't disappear just because you leave for a while. If you truly want to help others, you need to prepare yourself, and I'll be here to help you make it happen." Thomas looked up, his eyes bright with determination. "Thank you so much, sir," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how I can ever thank you enough." Arthur shook his head. "You don't need to thank me, Thomas. All I ask is that you never forget what truly matters. Always remember the power of kindness and how it can change lives." That decision didn't just open a new chapter for Thomas, it did the same for Arthur. He wasn't merely helping a young boy nurture his dreams. He was learning from him how to bring true meaning to his own life. In every design Thomas drew, in every idea he shared, Arthur saw a legacy he would leave behind. Autumn draped Ashwell Village in a new coat, as the leaves turned from green to vibrant gold. In the crisp, serene air, Ashwell was no longer the backward little village it had once been. Every road, every house bore the marks of its revival. People who had once left now returned, bringing their families, friends, and new hopes with them. Arthur, once a lonely man in his sprawling mansion, no longer felt out of place within the community. He had become a familiar figure at village meetings and events, often seen strolling through the streets to chat with residents. Children in the village had started calling him Kind Mr. Arthur, a nickname that never failed to bring a smile to his face each time he heard it. Thomas, after years of study and work at a prestigious university, returned to the village. Now a young, talented engineer, he had become a source of inspiration for the younger generation in Ashwell. He brought not only technical innovations, but also a philosophy of kindness, perseverance, and using knowledge to improve lives. At the village school, which once had only a handful of students, Thomas regularly held workshops on science and engineering. The children listened intently as he recounted stories from his youth, including the day he helped change a tire for a stranger. From one small act, my entire world changed, Thomas said with a smile. Always be willing to help others. You never know how far it might take you. His words, simple yet heartfelt, ignited a strong belief in the children that they, too, could achieve great things. For Arthur, seeing Thomas's growth and the prosperity of Ashwell brought him the greatest happiness he had ever known. He realized that a person's true legacy isn't found in material wealth, but in the connections they build with others. One evening, as Arthur sat at a small table in the kitchen of a village family's home, watching children laugh and play by the fire, he felt deeply that he was no longer an outsider. He had found his place in the community, not through money, but through sincerity and kindness. Time passed, leaving its mark on everything, and Arthur Bellamy was no exception. His steps grew slower, his hair turned completely white, but his eyes still shone brightly as he watched Ashwell continue to thrive. He knew he had lived a meaningful life, a life he once thought he would never find. One winter morning, as pale sunlight streamed through the windows of Ashwell Manor, Arthur Bellamy passed away peacefully in his sleep. His face was serene, as though he had never carried a burden. He left not just a grand estate, but an immeasurable legacy. Arthur's will was read to the entire village on an early spring afternoon, with apple blossoms blooming white along the pathways. He left Ashwell Manor to the village, along with a financial endowment to maintain and develop it into a community center. Ashwell Manor was no longer a symbol of isolation, but a place to bring people together. Thomas, now a grown man, was chosen to oversee the manor and continue the legacy Arthur had entrusted to him. Stepping into Ashwell Manor for the first time as its steward, Thomas knew he was embarking on a mission far greater than managing a property. It was a mission to carry forward Arthur's vision. Thomas never forgot the lesson Arthur had taught him. Kindness, when shared, changes not only the recipient but also the giver. He continued to spread those values, not just in Ashwell but in every community he worked with. He told Arthur's story to anyone willing to listen, a testament to how even small acts of kindness can create monumental change. One day, while leading a group of students through the old gardens of Ashwell Manor, a boy looked up and asked, "Mr. Thomas, why did Mr. Arthur do all of this?" Thomas smiled, his eyes filled with emotion, because he understood that life isn't about what we have, but what we leave behind. The sky over Ashwell that day was unusually blue, with soft white clouds drifting lazily, reflecting the peace of the village. Thomas walked along the cobbled paths that cut through the fields, his hands casually tucked into his coat pockets, the gentle breeze brushing his face. Beneath his feet, the worn stones, witnesses to generations of lives, felt as steadfast and warm as ever. With each step, Thomas could hear echoes of the past. He remembered his days as a boy, when Ashwell was still shrouded in silence and despair. Before Arthur Bellamy entered his life, bringing the light of change, he thought of the flat tire by the roadside, of Arthur's contemplative gaze as he insisted on expressing his gratitude fully. As he passed through the old garden of Ashwell Manor, Thomas paused and took a deep breath, letting the memories flood back. He thought of afternoons spent beside Arthur, sketching the first designs, of the pride in Arthur's eyes whenever he presented a new idea. Above all, he remembered the words Arthur had told him, not once, but many times. Life isn't about what you take, but what you give. A gentle smile spread across Thomas's lips, soft yet profound. Those words had not only changed the way he viewed life, but had become a guiding principle for every step he took and every decision he made. Thomas continued his walk through the familiar paths, greeted warmly by the villagers. Some stopped to chat, while children ran past, calling his name with admiration. He knew that what Arthur had left behind wasn't just a material legacy, but a spirit of generosity, kindness, and hope. Stopping by the riverside, where the mill wheels still turned steadily, Thomas sat on a wooden bench. The golden afternoon sun bathed the flowing water, reflecting the image of the mill, a symbol of the village's rebirth and of his own. Closing his eyes, he let the sounds of the water, the wind, and distant laughter fill his mind. He knew that while Arthur Bellamy was gone, his spirit lingered in every corner of Ashwell, in every heart he had touched. No matter how far Thomas might travel, his heart would always belong to Ashwell, the small village where it all began, with a lonely man, a boy with small but strong hands, and an old mill by the river. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey with Arthur and Thomas here on Echoes of Empathy. If this story has touched your heart, sparked compassion, or inspired you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to help us reach our milestone of 1,000 subscribers. Your support not only motivates us, but also enables us to continue sharing meaningful stories about kindness and connection. See you in the next story.